Welcome,
I got my
everyone.
note.
My name is Dr. Anandi Narasimhan, and today I have the pleasure of speaking to some very special guests as part of the Building Bridges talk on behalf of the World Humanitarian Drive, an organization that was formed with the vision of promoting peace, education, and trade harmony worldwide. Today, we will be discussing the effect of immigration policies on children. I would like to set the intention of our conversation with a quote from the late Mexican author, Carlos Fuentes. Recognize yourself in he or she who are not like you or me. As Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel has also reminded us, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Today's panelists were chosen for making a difference through their ongoing advocacy efforts to protect the well-being of children affected by immigration policies at the border. So let's get started. Joining us today are Dr. Amy Cohen, who is the executive director and co-founder of Every Last One. She is a child and family psychiatrist who has spent much of her long professional career addressing the trauma issues of vulnerable populations of children and families. She is a member of Physicians for Human Rights and serves on the medical and scientific advisory board of the National Center for Youth Law. Next, we have Mrs. Casey Revkin, who is the CFO and co-founder of Every Last One. She is a financial expert, a mother, and dedicated supporter of migrant children. She was the former president of the Silver Lake Moms Club, and Casey sees her work at Every Last One as a natural extension of years as an advocate for local children. Her efforts are the administrative backbone of Every Last One. We also have the guest of honor, Dr. Colleen Kraft, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. She is a professor of pediatrics at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California, and Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. Her work includes integration of behavioral health into primary care practice. I thank you all for joining us, and I very much look forward to our conversation today. I'm going to start out by just giving a brief introduction. For decades, people have come across the US-Mexican border seeking protection. But there has been a change in the last few years with immigration policies. We have an international audience viewing this broadcast, many of them who may not be familiar with these policies and these changes. As I was doing my own research about it, there were many policies that have been introduced. They're all quite confusing to read about and to kind of understand the complicated interplay and application of protection and border processing policies. Some of these policies include the Migrant Protection Protocols, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico, metering, the Prompt Asylum Chain Review, and Humanitarian Asylum Review Process programs. Dr. Cohen, can you help us make sense of some of these policies? What has changed in the last couple of years?
Well, I think that some of the changes really started back after the fall of the Twin Towers, when there was a shift from the Immigration Naturalization Service into the Department of Homeland Security. And I think that became an opportunity for immigration, which had always been something of a political football, to be even further politicized as people were made to fear more and more people who were coming into this country. What we've seen since the beginning of this administration in terms of changes is really what I would say a shift in perspective from efforts not always successful to sort out how to best work with immigrating populations either in their own countries or to reduce the number of people coming to our borders, to a policy that really has been designed to create to keep people from coming because of fears of what will happen to them if they come. So it's really been a policy of deterrence. I say that in quotes because when people are coming, fleeing the kinds of circumstances that many of the people are fleeing from places like Central America, there is no deterrence. They're fleeing threats of violence and death and murder. Their children are profoundly at risk. And as someone has said, if you're in a burning house and you close a door and lock it, someone will come through the window. So people don't really have a choice about whether to remain in their countries. But what we have seen is what I believe are deliberate policies of cruelty, with the hope that the damage that is done to both children and families will be taken back to their countries to keep others from coming.
Can you describe a little bit about that damage that is done
Yes,
with to children?
absolutely. Perhaps from my point of view, even beyond the appalling situation in border protection facilities and with the child separation policy, which people are aware of, the migrant protection protocols, which is rather an ironic title for this program, is from my point of view the most severely damaging, trauma-inducing, and life-threatening of all of the immigration policies. And what it states is that people who come to the United States seeking asylum will be placed in border towns in Mexico, which are designated by the Immigration Service to await the adjudication of their asylum proceedings. These towns and cities along the border are some of the most dangerous cities in the world. Dangerous enough to warrant the highest category of risk as defined by the State Department. In some of them, State Department employees will never be sent because they are that dangerous. And what happens is that people, once they are briefly adjudicated through the Customs and Border Patrol system, are then driven to and dropped off in these cities where they must remain because they are given a particular court to which they must go. So they're not permitted to move around in Mexico, even though they technically have permission to do that. If they're assigned, for example, to the city of Nuevo Laredo, they must stay in Nuevo Laredo. When they're dropped off, they're left at the Mexican immigration centers to receive a piece of paper saying that they're permitted to be in Mexico, and then they're left on their own. They're given no shelter, they're given no food, they're given no way to protect themselves, they're given no way to care for themselves. Many of these people are single parents with very, very small children. And I would say that the vast majority of these people have at least been kidnapped, but virtually all of them, close to all of them, have suffered some form of human trafficking since they have been there. Some, including children, have been murdered. Many have been kidnapped and both physically and sexually assaulted in front of their children, in front of very small children, kept for days at a time. And my organization has been in a position to try to rescue some of these people. We have one client with whom we've worked who was picked up with her 5-year-old and 1-year-old child. Virtually the day that she arrived in Mexico, she barely escaped being kidnapped minutes from her arrival there when the rest of her group were in fact kidnapped. She was then taken by a group of men into a house and kept for days and experienced horrific physical and sexual assault. And her 5-year-old daughter was forced to watch. When she went to a judge begging at her hearing, telling what had happened and begging to be allowed into the United States, where her children's father is legally residing with her 9-year-old son, he told her that there was nothing he could do, sent her to border protection. She was again forced to repeat this horrific story. And again, they refused to allow her to come over. Weeks after that, the same men came into the shelter where she and her children were staying, kidnapped her again, and assaulted her again. This is not anywhere close to being a unique story. This has happened to thousands upon thousands of families and children. many of whom will never be the same from the trauma that they've experienced.
You're a psychiatrist. Can you understand or explain what's the justification for some of these changes in policies? Is it simply a matter of economics? Is it an effective campaign to dehumanize these people and deter them? So what's your understanding of why were these changes made in the first place?
Um, there's a difference between the politics of this, which is not my purview, but if you read what is now has now been extensive communication from Stephen Miller, who is the principal architect of this president's immigration policies, deterrence and punishment have been the principal motivations, so that once again, the hope with this program, like the program of family separation, has been to basically send these people fleeing back to their countries of origin as if they were heads on a pike, telling people there what has happened to them and demonstrating that through their children. Some of these children have been so damaged by this trauma that they've lost developmental gains that they've already made. They've lost their speech, they've lost their capacity to socially interact. Many of them appear to be psychotic. And so, I'm not in the shoes of the people who are making these decisions, but so far as we know, particularly in terms of how successful programs been before in allowing families and children to remain in this country while their cases were adjudicated, there's no reasonable justification for this other than one of cruelty and what would be considered what this administration thinks of as deterrence. There also is a political upside in that, again, since 9/11, there's been an increasing, I think, use of immigration as a wedge issue with Americans. And I think that this administration thinks that it is pleasing its supporters by exerting this kind of cruelty on this particular population.
I want to get back to you later on the specific emotional and psychological consequences that some of these policies have had. But before that, I want to bring in Dr. Kraft. Dr. Kraft, the former US Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, officially enacted the family separation policy on May 7th, 2018. A month later, on June 17th, she tweeted, "We do not have a policy of separating families." During her 16-month tenure, 2,600 children were separated as a result of this family separation policy. During her congressional hearing, she repeatedly said that these policies were implemented with ongoing consultation with experts in the field of pediatrics. I didn't think any pediatrician or child psychiatrist would want this to happen, so I contacted some of your leadership at the American Academy of Pediatrics. They described the consultations to me as more ineffective conversations that seem to go nowhere. Can you explain to us how, as the former president of the Academy, how you came to know about the policy, what your involvement was, and how did the communication go?
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. In 2017, we had conversations with Kirstjen Nielsen's office, and we're hearing from our pediatricians that families were being separated and kids were being taken away at the border. And a couple of our pediatricians actually did some consultative work with the Office of Refugee Resettlement and saw these kids where they were by themselves without their parents after they had been separated. And our communication with Secretary Nielsen's office was really met with nothing. We sent our concerns, we had phone calls, we had letters, we had people trying to set up meetings, and we got nowhere with her. At the same time, as we got into 2018, we actually heard the president say that these people are felons, we have to take their children away. So there was, in fact, a zero tolerance policy separating parents and children at the border. What happened to start changing that in 2018 started with a visit that I made down to the border and went to see kids in an Office of Refugee Resettlement colony and house. And when you walk in there, I walked into the toddler room. And you know how toddlers are. Toddlers are rambunctious and they're happy and they're jumping around and they're loud and they're noisy. There were 15 toddlers in this room and they were silent, except for one little girl who was crying and sobbing and beating her little fists on the ground. And you looked at this picture and you knew that these children were traumatized and they just needed their parents. And we couldn't give them that. Their parents had been separated and we didn't know where they were. And these kids didn't know where they were. And that whole episode really crystallized the whole topic of toxic stress to these kids' brains. And that's really where those developmental regressions come from that Dr. Cohen had mentioned. I wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Los Angeles Times about separating parents and children is exactly what we are against in pediatrics. And it makes no sense for these kids. That was actually picked up by a number of people, including Oprah Winfrey, who called me one day and said, what can we do about this? And from there, what we did was I met with Gail King. We went back down to the border. We started an education campaign on what separation of children and families does to that little developing brain and how that toxic stress keeps that brain from developing and actually causes both emotional regression and developmental regression. And by the end of the week, we had people on both sides of the aisle. We had people across the political spectrum saying hurting children is wrong. And the zero tolerance policy officially ended then. But sadly, it's still happening. We know it's still happening. We actually, Sally Goza, who's our current AAP president, just put an op-ed into CNN a couple of days ago talking about family separation, how it's still happening, how it can't happen, how we need to be able to have our parents and children together.
What strategies did you use through the American Academy of Pediatrics to enact change?
You know, I think the first strategy was calling the science what it was. So, you know, we have known throughout history that separating parents and children was not a good thing. We knew it in Australia with our Aboriginal populations. We knew it with our Native American populations in the United States. We knew it with the First Nations populations in Canada. But what was different now is that we know the science. And we know that when you increase cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine and inflammatory markers, because you have toxic stress, because you have that unmitigated hormonal change in the brains of these young children, where you don't have a parent who can modulate that stress and help that child through that difficult time, we know that those chemicals actually produce a pattern of neuronal synapses not developing right, and that these kids begin to understand that strong impact of fear. And what gets pruned away is their ability to speak and read and bond and be able to trust an adult. And so we had the science that told us why this was harmful and brain damage for these kids. And I called it government sanctioned child abuse, which I still believe it is. And we were able to take the science, explain to the general public why this was wrong and why we know this is wrong, and then bring people together to say this has got to change.
As a child psychiatrist, I know that emotional stress and mental stress increases the risk of the development of medical issues as well. And we do know that there were children who died in custody. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happens to them physically on a medical level and how these children passed away?
So the children who passed away at the border generally passed away from an acute infectious disease. So we had one child that had a bacterial sepsis. We had one child who had influenza. And what happens is along the journey, there's lots of stresses. Now, they have a parent with them who can help to modulate that stress, but many of these children showed up sick. And instead of actually getting these children help, they were put into Customs and Border Protection, into the cages, into family detention, and nobody really recognized how sick these children were. Some of the problem is that the medical personnel at the border are generally emergency medical technicians. They don't have any pediatric training. And those of us who take care of children know that a child could be looking good. They could be joking and talking to you and active one minute and then go into septic shock the next. I mean, the trajectory from looking well and acting well to being very sick is very different in pediatrics than it is in adult medicine. When we're, as adults, when we're feeling sick, we slow down, we rest. Kids don't do that. They go, and if they are developing shock, that happens very, very quickly. And so I think that the medical personnel didn't have the training to recognize how sick these children were. And in a couple of cases, kids actually went to the emergency department, were discharged, and then went back into Customs and Border Protection custody and died in their custody.
Can I
You-
add just one thing to that, Anandi? I think that Dr. Kraft would agree that the conditions that children faced, apart from the medical negligence or the failure to provide adequate pediatric care, the conditions that they faced on their own in border protection custody were themselves conducive to the acquisition of infectious diseases, and certainly not conducive to the capacity to get past those infectious diseases. Those places are freezing cold. The lights are on 24 hours a day, so they're unable to sleep. The nutrition is inadequate.
Toilets, there's
Open
inadequate
toilets.
water. So and they're conditions that if you're not sick, you could get sick, and if you are sick, you can get sicker. So.
Right, exactly.
Along those terms, Dr. Cohen, could you tell us a little bit more about the emotional trauma and that interplay between the emotional trauma and physical illness?
Yeah, if we think about it, the human child is, of all species, more dependent upon the nurturance of an adult in order to survive for a longer period of their life than any other species. And so it makes sense that children have built-in mechanisms to summon their nurturing adult, because that is what's required to survive. And so, as Dr. Kraft was describing, this kind of escalating stress that children experience when they do what is natural for them to do, what we've seen every child do if they get lost in the supermarket or lost at the beach, they start to cry. If there's no response or they don't find their parents, that cry escalates. As that escalation happens, more and more of these chemicals that Dr. Kraft was describing pour into the body. Those chemicals don't only affect the sort of emotional experience of children, but they affect the immune system, they affect the cardiovascular system, they affect the brain architecture, not just the mind, not just the emotional experience, but the actual architecture of the brain itself. So we see shrinkage of the brain. We see the children who have been subjected to protracted stress actually have loss of brain mass as a consequence. And in these facilities, on top of the cruelty of simply being separated from their parents, there also are rules and regulations in, for example, the Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters, which forbid the capacity of children not only to be picked up and held by adults, but even to hold each other, even siblings, to touch or hold each other. And we know that children require human touch in order to experience comfort. So in addition to imposing upon these children the terrible stress and trauma of separation from the trusted adults in their lives, whether these are parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, the people who brought them and who they rely on. In addition to that, the the need that they have for soothing is denied to them by the very rules that exist, that continue to exist in immigration facilities to which they're condemned. And I want to add too that, you know, people are hearing now about how parents, family detention, for example, are being given an impossible choice of having to choose between keeping their children with them in a dangerous situation and an emotionally very damaging situation for both parents and adults, or separating from them, which is really an impossible choice. That's been called separation 2.0, but what we've seen, and this is really important to emphasize, is that separation has never stopped. Child separation from parents and caregivers has never stopped. Even after the zero tolerance policy ended, we know that within a year, there were more than 1,000 children who had been taken from parents, many for absolutely no good reason. These parents are not actually felons. What they carry is, in 99% of the cases, the misdemeanor of having crossed between legal border crossing points. And in addition to that, the MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, also represent a child separation policy, because the parents in Mexico have been forced to choose between keeping their children in these horrible, sordid, dangerous conditions, both physically in terms of the neglect, the impossibility of finding shelter, of getting food, the filth, the exposure to illness, and also the terror of the risk of being trafficked and kidnapped. Whether keeping them with them there and keeping them safe, or sending children as small as 4 and 5 years old over the bridges by themselves. This has been, in working with parents and children, one of the most traumatic and painful experiences that I've seen parents have to make, have to live through, and most painful experiences that they've had to make. So the MPP program is also a child separation program.
I want to ask you to tell us a bit about how you got involved with these children at the border. I know that you testified on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights. Can you explain your background?
Yes, so as a child psychiatrist, as soon as I knew about the family separation program, and I had worked, as you had said, in the area of trauma in vulnerable populations of children, including internationally, for many, many years. And I knew very specifically what was happening to these children. I put everything on hold and went down to the border and started to work on the border and with these children who were being newly released from the border protection, customs and border protection facilities. Through that work, I became increasingly involved with attorneys who were working with children, particularly a group called Flores. The Flores Settlement Agreement is the single agreement which exists to mandate oversight of facilities where children are detained on their own in this country or with their families in this country. And the Flores Settlement Agreement sets out minimal standards for that detention. I was asked by the Flores attorneys to work with them, and I was also asked by a group of attorneys who were filing suit on behalf of parents who were about to be deported because they'd been administered what's called a credible fear interview right after their children had been taken from them during zero tolerance. Those parents had failed those what are called credible fear interviews, where they have to speak and convince somebody that they have a credible fear because they were so themselves traumatized and distressed. So I was asked to interview these parents and to write testimony affidavits on their behalf to keep them from being deported and to force the government to throw away all of their negative credible fear interviews and give them new ones after they've been reunited with their children. So that, for me, began an intersection which I had for many years in my practice, in any case, between law and medicine, and a real interest in, both the immediate trauma work and assistance in getting children out of these facilities, out of these OR facilities, working on the ground with families, and the legal work and the policy work, and research. So all of those things for me sort of knitted together, which is how Casey and I ended up collaborating to start Every Last One, as an organization that really would embrace all of those aspects of the protection of these children, trying to prevent, to mitigate, and to treat the trauma that immigration policy exposes them to.
What was the reception to your testimony?
To my testimony at the Senate?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
Well, I think it's important to put it in context. The Senate hearing was held very shortly after there had been these Flores visits to border protection facilities, which were these places people have often seen the pictures of children in cages, these places that Dr. Kraft and I have both described as these really unsanitary and unsafe places for children. Because there had been a spate of newspaper articles, the public was inflamed about this, and the hearing was actually held in order to address that particular issue. The government at the time was claiming that these facilities were not designed for children. It was no fault of their own. The problem with these facilities was that there was such a flood of children and families to the border that they had no choice but to keep them, and to keep them for longer times than they were legally permitted to keep them, because they had no place to put them. So when I testified, I think the expectation was that I testified with 3 colleagues from other fields, that we would all testify specifically about what was going on in these facilities. It was my feeling that it was important to look at what was going on in Customs and Border Protection facilities as a function of the much larger immigration issue. The larger issue being that we had at the time about 15,000 children in Office of Refugee Resettlement custody, because children in these child detention centers were not being released to sponsors, even their parents, in anything close to a timely fashion. They were being kept for much longer than they should have been kept. Because that was the case, the system was backing up. The system was backing up, enabling the government to create unlicensed facilities in the form of something called Tornillo and Homestead, and ultimately to keep more and more children in Customs and Border Protection. I think that the senators were interested. I think that they care, but sadly, I would have to say that politically we have really seen nothing in the way of policy to truly protect and address the problems of these terribly vulnerable and traumatized children. As Dr. Kraft said, they're traumatized often in their journeys to the United States, but one has to remember that they were traumatized in their countries of origin. They've often seen family members murdered. They've had their own family threatened. Many of them themselves have been approached in school and threatened by gangs. They've had classmates murdered in their hometowns. They've been kept from going to school because school is such a dangerous place, because the gangs roam the school. So these are very, very vulnerable children, and all along the way, in every setting in which this immigration system is placing them, they are enduring more and more complex trauma. And that complex trauma, I think Dr. Kraft would agree, it builds up not in an additive way, but in a multiplicative way, so that each trauma that a child endures makes them more vulnerable to more serious symptoms from the next trauma that they endure. So these children are multiply traumatized kids, and they receive little or no treatment for that trauma. And so we really, really worry about their prognosis long-term.
I want to bring in Mrs. Casey Revkin. Thanks for waiting patiently. Casey, you're a mom, you have a career. What made you feel compelled to do more?
Right. So I knew nothing about immigration and just heard the stories in the spring, summer of 2018 that children were being separated from their parents. And my son was 3 years old at the time, and I just wanted to do something. So I took a crash course in immigration policy, and one of the first things that happened is there was a 4-year-old girl who had been separated from her grandmother at the border. And I think this brings up a good point where advocates and journalists have identified 5,400 children who have been separated from their parents at the border in the last 3.5 years. But what number nobody knows is that any kid who arrives with any caregiver who is not their parent is automatically separated. And so this 4-year-old came with her grandmother, and she was automatically separated from her grandmother at the border. They came to a legal port of entry, and she was taken away, and her mom was already here and had no idea how to start to get her back, to get her out. And she was 4 and in detention. And somebody reached out to us because they had actually gotten the packet to begin the process. And they, of course, didn't have a printer, and they didn't have a fax machine, and they didn't have the $50 it would take to print the documents and fax them, fill them out and fax them in. And it was like, I know people with $50. We can fix this. And we helped them through the whole process. And it took 47 days, and she was eventually released to her parents. But we had to raise a lot of money and organize a lot of people to make that happen. And we did this several times over the next year. And then at one point, we figured out we should make this into an organization. There are so many kids in detention who have families who are desperate to get them out, and they don't know where to start. And we do know where to start. So let's make an organization and make this happen. And I found Amy, and I'd met Amy over the course of this work, and we got together and started this, and have really been able to make a difference and help families.
Can you describe a little bit more of your role in every last one? I know that you're the administrative backbone.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, so there's a lot of, every organization needs administration. So we, everyone on the team is out there trying to identify and find these families, because they don't necessarily know that we exist. I'm part of, so get the word out there that we do exist and we're here to help them. And we can help them through the process, and it doesn't cost them any money. And so a big part of my work is amplification. And also I want the public to know what's going on and to understand what is still happening to children, that this wasn't an issue that was solved in 2000, that was brought to the public's attention and solved in 2018, that kids are still in detention and need help getting out.
When you and I had discussed this at one point, I don't know if you remember telling me, but you described it like a dam slowly breaking, and that you could put your finger in a few holes, but it wasn't the solution. It wasn't going to change the justification or the policies that were in play, but you could try and fill in some gaps. Tell me a little bit more about, and Dr. Cohen, you can jump in on this as well, the future direction of every last one, what you're looking to do more.
Right. So what we do is we help individual families get their children out of detention, and we help individual families in the Remain in Mexico program and other things like that. But this is a big policy issue. One thing, this is a big policy issue, and to solve this on a grand scale, we have to have an administration that doesn't try to invent new ways to harm children every time they get a chance.
Dr. Kraft, we are in a pandemic right now. Can you give me your thoughts on how the pandemic is affecting these policies and how it's affecting these families?
Well, I think the biggest thing that the pandemic has done is taken our eyes off of them. So we're not really thinking about these kids at the border and these families at the border because we're so concerned about COVID-19. But we know that in crowded conditions, we know that when you have people who are together in close spaces and I'm guessing nobody's wearing masks in these places here, that COVID-19 spreads. I mean, I see it in my practice in Los Angeles. The other night, I had 4 children who had each lost a parent in one night to COVID-19. We also know that we are exporting COVID-19 back to Central America through these refugees. So the families have been deported. About 75% of them have been positive for COVID-19. So we're sending that back along with these families. So not good. We're really doing a lot of harm to these families. And where children are physically less affected, we know this by COVID-19, some of them get very sick with it. And that families and people with chronic medical conditions can be very, very sick with it as well too. So it's a problem, but it's not one that we're putting our eyes on a lot right now, because we have so much that's happened because of COVID-19, medically, economically, other ways that it's been a tragedy.
I'd like to add something to that if I could. And I think the point that Dr. Kraft makes, that we're exporting this to Central American countries, is so critical. And exporting that in the form of deportations. One of the things we have developed at every last one, is really an international arm of our organization, so that we have contacts on the ground, not only in Mexico, partner organizations, not only in Mexico, but also in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras. This has become more urgent since we have now seen the onset of deportations of children on their own, which have exploded over the past month. So the United States is now taking children again as young as 3 and 4 years old by themselves, and putting them on airplanes and shipping them back to countries without any due process, without any capacity to ask for asylum. We have seen some of these children, many of whom are being sent back to places where they have no caregiver. Many times they have their caregivers here in the United States. Many times they've fled on their own, which is a terrifying thing to do. It really requires not just bravery, but it requires real fear for a child to actually leave their home by themselves and make it to the United States border. Within 48 hours, these children are being stuck on airplanes after being told that they'll be taken to American shelters, and they end up back in the country that they were fleeing because their lives were in danger. We're dealing right now with 2 children we had to place in hiding in Honduras because they were being so actively threatened. The United States is using the excuse of the COVID pandemic in order to justify these really atrocious deportations. We know from inconsistencies within the policy that that is really kind of a sham. And we also know that it would be a simple matter to place these children in quarantine for 14 days before we release them into the community. So, once again, COVID is being used not as a way to really address the public health needs either of this country or of the children in this country, but also to justify increasingly brutal policies toward children who are fleeing from other countries.
Well, what seems counterintuitive to me is that, COVID-19 has been so damaging to us economically. It's been damaging to politicians for their reputation. Wouldn't there be an incentive to address things like overcrowding, spreading COVID to other parts of the world, which will affect tourism in the future, because the COVID would come back if you spread it globally? So why isn't there that kind of thought process as well about it? Like, why don't we want to stop the spread of it rather than increase it?
I think that we have an international audience, so I think it will come as no surprise to anyone that the United States is a rather insular and isolationist country. I think we don't experience ourselves as belonging to the larger world, particularly now with an administration that is very much focused in that way. And Americans have, not experienced a war on our, within our own borders and on our shores to help us to recognize how interdependent we all are, both within this country and within the greater world. I think that there's been much more exporting of COVID to other countries than there has been importing of COVID from those countries. Those countries in Central America have been much, much more rigorous in terms of their controls of the illness. But so one might ask the questions, why are these countries accepting these deportations, which are bringing people who come from extremely crowded circumstances where we know there have been outbreaks, where they know they really represent kind of petri dishes of COVID to these other countries. But within the detention facilities themselves, where you would think that we would want to release people, that we would want to not have these centers where COVID is going to take hold and spread, that there would be more of a push to release detainees who represent no other threat to the United States, to place them in quarantine, release them out into the community. And we're not seeing much of that happening at all. And again, I think it's because there is this very kind of limited experience of how whatever happens to my neighbor happens to me. You know, the reason for controlling COVID from the beginning, apart from the fact that we wanted to see fewer deaths, was because we know that the danger is that COVID will and has now overwhelmed the medical community in terms of its capacity, not only to face the illness, but then in turn to face whatever other emergencies, surgical or medical or otherwise, come about. So when you have a detention center within a community where you're not letting people out, where you're seeing this like lit match to dry tinder spread of COVID, you're not only endangering all of the people within that facility, but you're also endangering the larger community. Because what will happen when those people become intensively ill, unless the administration brutally decides that they're going to lock the door and just let them die, they're going to be taken to local hospitals. That's going to infect the entire community. The people who work in these facilities come into and go out of these facilities. That affects the entire community. But once again, there's been success in somehow, a kind of trick of the mind in imagining that what we are doing to immigrants in these facilities and exposing them in this way is not going to affect the larger community of Americans. As if our treatment of the immigrants wasn't enough, if the treatment of our migrants wasn't enough, even if all we are concerned about is our own self-interest. You're absolutely right that this does not benefit the United States and its health.
And I would just summarize that and say that sadly in the United States, science has not informed our national policy around the treatment of COVID-19. Science never informed the treatment of these refugees or children seeking asylum. And science continues to not inform what we're doing with these families and these children.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an asylum evaluator for Physicians for Human Rights, and prior to COVID, they were having these short-term deployments where they would send members to their center in Brownsville to do in-person evaluations and assessments, and that was stopped. And now most of the evaluations are happening virtually. Dr. Cohen, are you finding that there is now much more difficulty in accessing these families or even conversing with them?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt, there is. And even partner organizations who would sometimes be able to monitor and inform us where there were outbreaks or where there were worries or where there were families in danger, they also are often not going in or meeting virtually, which, as Dr. Kraft will say as well, I think is very, very different than meeting in person or sitting in person with a child or family. In Mexico along the border, it's really been a disaster because in that case where once again, not only, terrible conditions in terms of physical conditions and lack of nutrition and lack of shelter and so forth existed before, now because NGOs and other volunteer organizations which had eyes on some of these people who were some of the migrants and asylum seekers who were there have now left and are not able to cross the border, two things have happened. One, once again, it means that there's less care, less treatment, less availability of care for those who are there, who are highly vulnerable to, again, being traumatized, becoming ill. It has also meant that because there's less supervision, there's been, as I've heard now from Doctors Without Borders, which has done some partnering with us, and from UNHCR, that there's been more infiltration of the encampments of asylum seekers by the gangs themselves. So whereas they were more circumspect before, things would wait until after dark, the kidnappings, the assaults would take place outside the encampment. Now they have infiltrated themselves into the encampment. The extortion behavior, playing on the fears of migrants, trying to sell them passage to the United States, but then kidnapping them and taking them elsewhere for the purpose of trafficking. This is happening increasingly because, once again, there are fewer eyes on any of these areas because people are confined. So yes, there's been a very profound and direct effect in terms of the health and trauma of the children and families that we're seeing.
One of the principles of problem-focused therapies involve not just focusing on why something happened, but what next? What's the solution? Can you describe what are the next steps that you believe need to happen?
Well, November is coming. I think what needs to happen is that I think within the United States, our Congress needs to become far more active, take a far more active role in affirming the United States as a humanitarian and humane nation that cares about the international community of suffering and endangered children. We have not seen that happen, and that is deeply disturbing. And as a consequence, from my point of view, we've really seen a deterioration of the overall humanity and of our nation, which is deeply shameful to many of us. I think also that the international community needs to be more active in holding the United States responsible for doing its part in providing refuge, particularly to children and families who are fleeing absolutely impossible conditions, not just economically, but in terms of, there's not only because of their survival economically, but also because of their survival due to violence. The conditions that many of these families are living in are as unsafe as any declared war conditions. The violence that they're being exposed to is no different than if bombs were falling from the skies, and they face it every single day. And the United States has to be held accountable, both for its failure to provide asylum, as should be its responsibility as the most wealthy nation on earth, but also for what many of us consider to be crimes against humanity, and which are being committed particularly against these vulnerable populations of children. Many of us would like to see the international community step up and address this on an international stage, and bring some pressure to bear on the United States. Hold it accountable.
I think that for a lot of individuals who might be watching and tuning in, they wonder, what can I do as an individual? I'm one person, and I'm not that powerful. So as part of Every Last One's initiative going forward, what can individuals do to help?
I could speak to that. I feel like I've spoken so much. Casey, do you want to address that?
Well, a big thing that anyone can do that also is very easy is amplify the situation. I think people do not know what is going on, and it would break their heart to hear it, and people will get involved and public pressure we've seen has worked. The administration has floats ideas all the time. Hey, maybe we'll try this. And if there's enough, and they tried family separation, for example, and there was so much public outrage that they backed off. And they need that pressure. So just sharing this, sharing what's going on. We have a Facebook page and Instagram and Twitter. You can follow us at Every Last One with the number 1. What else were you going to say, Amy? Beyond amplification.
Yeah, I think the amplification is critical. You know, what is very disturbing to all of us who work in this field, and I think Dr. Kraft alluded to this as well, is that we see these bursts of concern which very quickly disappear. This is a very nimble administration. It knows how to clean up the mess that people are noticing and then put it somewhere else, which is one of the reasons that Every Last One has been designed to be a nimble organization that can go wherever those problems are, whether they're here in the United States, in Mexico, or on the ground in countries of origin. We also think, I would say that, you know, there's an absence of addressing of the problems that lead to the kinds of migration patterns that we see, whether they're economic or you know, violence, you know, that spurs these waves of immigration. The extreme shift in migration patterns to the United States across the southern border really was represented not by numbers. There were actually more numbers that were coming a decade ago, but really by the types of people who were coming over. It used to be more adult males who were coming looking for work. It has now increasingly become unaccompanied minors and families. The reason for that is the violence in these countries, which makes circumstances impossible for these families. So I think it also behooves the international community to push for demands that there be safety measures for these people within their own countries, that the issue of gangs and of drug cartels, which, as we know, is an international issue, it's not a national issue. We know that one of the reasons that these gangs have flourished is because the drug trade was shifted, much of it from the Caribbean to Central America, that had to do with international policy, that people demand, once again, that their governments look at that and look for that. I think as individuals, as Casey said, the most important thing is to keep this issue alive, to let people know that every single day when you wake up in the morning, go to bed at night, there are more children whose lives have been foreshortened by the trauma that the United States is imposing on them. And for people to call for their own governments to address this on an international stage. You know, we're doing all that we can in the United States to amplify this issue, to inform the public in the United States. I think for people in other countries, it would be enormously helpful for them to push their governments to hold the United States accountable. This is an international community of children. If there is nothing that speaks to the need for humanity, it has to be child suffering. And I think that the pressure, if the pressure were to come, if a spotlight were to be shown on these policies in other countries, in the press of other countries, that once again, that would bring more pressure for the United States to have to answer those charges, for the United States to have to speak to what we are doing to these children. So I think within their own countries, it would be enormously helpful if people could push their own governments to address this on the international stage.
Dr. Kraft, can you tell me about future directions of the American Academy of Pediatrics on this issue?
I think that the same points that that Dr. Cohen had made are really where the AAP is coming from as well too. I mean, they are shedding the light on kids being separated from parents, on what the harm is from the migrant protection protocol, but also on what are some of the solutions internationally. So I actually got to spend some time in Lebanon last year before everything just went nuts there, and got to spend some time in a Syrian refugee camp in Lebanon, and worked with a group called War Child, which really did trauma-informed care with these kids, did visioning, and you'd see these little girls come out and tell you they wanted to be a teacher and they wanted to be a doctor. And in a world where we have almost 71 million people who are globally displaced, there are places that are addressing the same problems that the United States is facing at the southern border, and they're doing it in a much better way. We as an international community need to learn from each other here, because it is not just our problem, and other places actually have more people who are involved in this, and that we can figure out how we take care of these people who are very vulnerable while addressing some of the inequities and some of the awful things that are happening in their home countries.
Casey, any specific requests that you have from the international community as part of every last one? Are there anything else that you could add? What's your ask?
Well, I do think those are the two big issues, is one, amplification, and two, to consider the issues that affect everyone in the world. I can tell you we specifically have a campaign right now to bring attention to 2 children who came here, were denied a chance to request asylum, and 3 days later were expelled alone back to their home country. And we believe that enough public pressure can bring these children back, in addition to the legal channels that we're working on with our partners. So if you want to follow us at Every Last One with the number 1, and amplify that, we would absolutely appreciate it.
We should, just to confuse the matter, we should say that our website is actually Every Last One with 1 spelled out. So everylastone.org is our website. And we've had a number of emergency situations like this one that Casey described, where, I'll get a phone call. It always happens on a weekend. It always happens on a Saturday or Sunday morning, where something terrible has happened. Where recently it was a 7-year-old who came across on his own after having been set afloat by himself on a raft on the Rio Grande. And we knew that he was going to be deported. We mobilized our partners. The ACLU is a partner organization of ours. And we've worked with the Texas Civil Rights Project and managed to keep this 7-year-old from being deported despite his being on the deportation manifest. So we've had a child who had a fractured skull who was not getting treatment in family detention. People found out about it. There was an enormous amount of pressure. We sometimes use our partners in the press to make sure that people are informed. But we do know that this pressure works. And so if we get pressure from the international community as well, we think that we're much more likely to be able to see much more significant changes, regardless of the administration. Congress has more power than it sometimes uses. And we would really like to see it address these horrors that we're seeing.
Dr. Kraft, similarly, does the American Academy of Pediatrics have any specific requests?
I think the request is really that we know how children should be treated, and that our administration and our policies mirror that science and evidence-based recommendations for the best treatment of these children, which is not what's happening right now.
And I would add one other thing to that, because I really want to endorse Dr. Kraft's, returning to the importance of the science. One of the things that is absolutely true in this country and in other countries as well, but particularly here, is that there's a curtain been pulled down over many of these settings where children are languishing and deteriorating, so that it becomes almost impossible for scientists, for researchers to get in and to see what is actually happening to these children, and therefore for any data to be generated overall. And Australia has not had a great track record, I have to say, in its treatment of asylum seekers. But one of the wonderful things that they did do was to form a scientific commission that was actually permitted access to children who were detained in family detention and so forth. And as a consequence, Australia has generated some of the most important and useful research. We need to be able to demand that organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, like the American Psychological Association, like child psychiatric associations, have access to these facilities, not to overrun them, not to interfere, but to be able to gain real scientific data about the impact of these policies on children and families. We don't have that access right now.
What I appreciate about this discussion is that so much of the time in academic settings and educational settings, we talk about policies, we talk about clinical cases in this very dry, objective, sterile decorum. And I really appreciate that all of you have added an emotional component to the discussion, because for so many of these children, it's an experiential reality. It's not an empirical reality. And I think it is so important when we discuss these policies for us to really understand and internalize the emotional pain that takes place. So I appreciate all of you for the work that you're doing, for the things that you've done already, and for what you will be doing ongoing to protect the well-being of these children. I am honored to be part of this discussion and to be able to bring you together and have this conversation. And so I want to offer my sincerest gratitude for your time this morning. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to the founder of World Humanitarian Drive, Dr. Abdul Basit Syed, who is in England, and I would love to hear your thoughts and concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Anandi. Dear respected Chief Guest, Global Humanitarian Award winner, Dr. Colleen Kraft, Honorable Speaker, Dr. Amy Cohen, Mrs. Casey Revkin, and WHD USA Secretary General, Dr. Anandi Narasimhan, an amazing person you are, who built and successfully delivered this online event. I wish you all peace and happiness, with thanks for willing to build bridges in people's heart through your thoughts and action for an immigration policy change. WHD, being a humanitarian organization founded by me to achieve its goal of peace, education, and trade harmony, today stand together with you in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, because we understand the effect of immigration policies on children and the importance of it being built. The building bridges during these challenging times is crucial to promote peace. Today, I promise you that we have 9 chapters around the world: UK, USA, Canada, Nepal, Albania, Bangladesh, Malaysia. So all these India, 9 chapters will be promoting your programs and the future events of yours. In this case, we will definitely try to achieve what we can do for the betterment of the children who are suffering all around the world. Today, we live in a world judged by religion, ethnicity, race, and sex. People are often stigmatized in the wrong way and become targets of hate groups. We have to give good voice. Hence, we must all work together to bring peace to these affected families and children. This requires commitment, vision, and leadership to bring fruitful results. They say, each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it possibly, without claiming it, she stands up for all women. Today, I've seen 4 women leaders sharing their thoughts and ideas to build bridges of hope, supporting and giving strong voice to the voiceless. Hence, I'm confident to say through this platform, as it's time for the world to recognize the benefits of women being in leadership and to commit placing even more women in positions of power to bridge happiness to families, especially in the immigration sectors. As women are the best policy makers in this world and act as a powerful agents of change, I believe this will bring far-reaching benefits of diversity and gender parity in leadership. There is no other alternative in the current situation where technology is used to build walls and spread fear. We must reach out to all community members to act proactively in this work to gain confidence and ensure that change in the immigration policy to bring peace to families as the most important asset to build happiness and peace in world is to get people's support and trust is by building happy families. WHD's purpose as humanitarians is to build trust in society and solve important problems between communities, focusing in particular on issues such as this. I suggest we do a common framework in promotion of similar events. Dear leaders of humanity, the experience of being treated fairly and justly is important for every person's sense of dignity. To promote understanding, to trust each other, which enhances the prospects for building peace and happiness for families in this world, is everlasting and should be everlasting. As a humanitarian, I humbly say that understanding and implementing of moral values to promote policies are the only lasting positive solution for human minds to understand the problems better. As I believe morality builds mind for equality by respecting all human beings. So I request you all to start with us with a campaign for World Moral Day, where we can all have a world filled with love and energy to support new policy changes with the wisdom of love and hatred for none. I end by saying, let's work to build bridges with love as our pledges. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
But
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for
Bye.
inviting us.